So my extension assignment is on personality disorders across cultures. So I wanted to understand the way that cultural differences influence psychology. Cultural factors are important in understanding how personalities and personality disorders look in different people and different cultures, and the way that we understand them. So as we know, language and culture affects the way that we think. For example, in the textbook, it mentioned that Japanese culture reflects a different meaning of the self than American culture. Japanese people tend to consider the self in more of a community sense, and American culture tends to understand it as an individual sort of sense. So I wanted to know how might this influence the way that people perceive themselves and the way they think about the world, and then what are the implications of this on personality disorders? So, one of the big questions I had was, is Western medicine pathologizing personality differences of different cultures? So, really quickly, the understanding of personality traits and personality as we understand it psychologically, we see that we have a big five. The basic traits that we see across the globe are extroversion, agreeableness, openness, conscientiousness, and neuroticism. And those are sort of what make up a personality, the various degrees of each of those characteristics. Um, but the idea of personality disorders, even the disorder, is controversial among some scholars, as it rests upon the idea that there is a goodness of fit between an individual's style of personality and the society with which they engage in. And the lack of that goodness of fit might be causing psychological distress. And we obviously understand personality disorders as creating dysfunction, which rightfully so, that makes sense. But where do we draw the line for dysfunction, is the question. And researchers have suggested that with globalization and cross cultural immigration has come pathologizing of cultural mixes, which obviously can have some problematic consequences. So I think the solution to a lot of this is more teaching in cultural relativism and assessments and cultural factors along with diagnoses, so that they can understand better the interplay between culture and personality. And I'll get into that a little bit more. So, an example is this study in urban and rural Africa. Um, Many studies around the world have shown that personality traits and levels of personality disorders are largely the same across regions, which makes sense. However, a lot of the data collected has been Western and Asian cultures of well educated populations. So they wanted to understand in this study. In Africa, the few studies that were conducted with well educated participants using French or English instruments. No research was conducted in Africa with less privileged or pre literate samples. And I think they wanted to understand what it means to be abnormal versus normal across these lines that we haven't really been studied yet. So they wanted to understand the normal and abnormal expressions of personality in the rural and urban areas of Burkina Faso, which is a Western African country. Um, and the idea they wanted to understand, can one fairly assess personality traits and personality disorders across cultures, and what are the implications of pathologizing the other? So they found that the structure underlying normal personality was unstable across regions and languages, illustrating that translating a complex psychological inventory into a native African language is a very difficult task, and not that necessarily different languages and cultures have different levels of personality disorders, but that trying to translate that into a scientific study is difficult for the people doing the research. And um, making a mistake in pathologizing the other might be seriously problematic. So I think that shows the distinct differences in languages, the affect the way that we think and act, and the way that we perceive ideas of normal in others. Our results suggest that studies using a different methodology should be conducted to understand what is considered in different cultures as deviating from the expectations of the individual's culture and as significant impairment in self and interpersonal functioning. So likely the differences, the unstable levels of personality dysfunction across regions, they chalked it up to this is difficult for us to get a good understanding of what normal and abnormal means across different lines. So the conclusion that I've drawn here, I think that we can take away from this is that most data and evidence suggests that personality traits and disorders do not vary greatly across cultural lines, and the distinctions of personalities across the globe are likely a result of a lack of understanding or inability to translate cultural differences, and to be wary of pathologizing different cultures based on sociocultural differences. And that is my presentation. Thank you very much.